Hello and welcome to Pontus Points, a channel where I will discuss hot topics, trying to stick to the facts. And my conclusion will most often be that neither the black or the white position is the right one. It's finding a place within the grayscale where the kind of optimal balance is. That will make my opinions rather unpopular, both amongst those who are hard-headed advocates of the black side and the white side. But that has to be it. I would still hope that you find that I have a point. So the first episode here would be the balance between combustion engine or electric vehicle. So we call them combustion, and I will say EV for the electric vehicle here. Neither solution is optimal for all the cases, and I don't believe anyone who says that either one is the optimal one. So it's not really sensible here to either side with the petrol heads nor the electric heads. You have to have a clear balance, look at the facts, and look at your particular use case, which is the best one for you. So let's look at a number of the aspects, and I will have some sort of summary down below in the comments, so you can click on each and every one of them. But the first one is time to destination. That sort of weighs in both the range aspect and also the time to refill. And here the EV's predominant drawback comes rather apparent. It has a shorter range on every refill, and the refills take a lot longer. So if you are traveling beyond the range of the car, that means that it will take a lot longer. But if you travel normally under like 400 kilometers, they are basically the same. There is no real difference unless you travel beyond the reach of what the car can give you. So it's not a negative aspect if you're traveling less than 400 kilometers to drive with an EV. But if you are going beyond the 400 kilometers or whatever your range is with your electric car, then you would have a negative impact of the EV there. And you would lose, let's say, around 30 minutes per 3-hour drive. So once you drive 3 hours, you would need to add like half an hour to recharge. But that is likely also a advantage that will diminish over time. And Mercedes is already showcasing a car that can go over 1,000 kilometers. And when it does that, that's sort of the same range as a normal, or like the diesels that can travel really long on every refill. Okay, the refill will still take a lot longer, but most people wouldn't travel beyond 1,000 kilometers a day anyways. So it's not really a thing if you need to charge during the night. So we can expect that ranges in electric vehicles will increase over time, at least as an option. But we can only look at what we have here and now, and the normal electric cars would only go like 400 or possibly even 500 kilometers. So it's a significant disadvantage if you're driving this far, but it is not a disadvantage if you regularly drive shorter than that. So if you look at your own usage pattern, are you driving more than 400 kilometers a day on a regular basis, or is that not really practically something that would limit you? That's something you need to factor in when you choose between the two options. Or are you okay with taking like a regular break? If you travel 3 hours and you have half an hour break for coffee or food or going to the loo, is that a negative thing for you, or are you, because you're normally like bringing food into the car, eating in the car, and having a quick toilet break, and that would only take a few minutes, and then you want to be off because you really want to be there fast? A number of the factors that you need to weigh in if you want to look at if this is a practical disadvantage for you. I should be sort of clear that I've had a car for, I don't know, 25, 30 years. And and I've had an EV for the last 1 year. And for me, I am doing this. I'm driving like 600 kilometers, and it takes me an hour longer than it used to do when I had like a diesel car. So, but factoring in all the aspects, I actually came to the conclusion still that the EV was what's beneficial for me. But this is sort of the penalty. I'm fully aware that this is the penalty I'm paying for my choice. Yeah, and moving to the next thing is availability of chargers versus like availability of petrol stations. For combustion engines, so the petrol stations, they are sort of all over the place. And this is different in different parts of the world, of course, but EV chargers are getting more and more frequent. And Tesla they do have their own set of chargers that used to be sort of exclusive to Tesla. So if you had a Tesla, you could charge there, but you can also charge in all the other public ones. Now, in many countries, I cannot say all countries, but at least in many countries, Tesla has chosen to make their chargers available to everybody. So if you have another brand of an EV, you can also charge with Teslas, which makes the availability of chargers a lot bigger for the non-Tesla drivers. But of course, if you compare the number of chargers versus the availability of petrol stations, in most countries, I would say that the petrol stations are still more frequent. But the nuance here is if you go to a petrol station, you charge up, you can normally pay with your credit cards. If you don't have like a member card of a petrol station chain, you can still pay using your credit card. Whereas with the EVs, they are typically unmanned, which means that when you pay for that, you need to have an app and you need to associate your credit card with that provider of charge, which is an extra nuance. Of course, only the first time you do it per sort of chain, but it's still a nuance. And also, I mean, given that charging takes longer, there is a risk of queues on EV charging that isn't really there for petrol station refills. Everybody has been queuing on petrol stations, but it's only for a few minutes. But in the worst case scenario for an EV, it could be a lot longer than that. I mean, if you have 5 people on queue and every one of them would be charging 30 minutes, in theory, if you accumulate that, that's a long wait, and you really don't want that. But again, I've had my EV now for a year, and it never happened to me. I do have a Tesla, and I had the exclusive access to Tesla's charging stations. And I never had to queue. And I know that people having EVs with other brands, they had to queue. But now when Tesla's network is also open to the others, I haven't heard anyone complaining about availability of charging station. It might be that the first day of holiday or something like that, there is still like a theoretical risk of this happening. But and it's really important that the build out here of the charger network is going sort of at least as fast as the sales of EVs. Otherwise, you would still have the probability of queuing up increasing over time. But here in Sweden, they are building charging stations like crazy. So I really don't think this is an issue that is really practical. Sound. Yeah, well, I know that a number of petrol heads, they love the sound of their cars. EV gives no sound. If you back up with a Tesla, it will give you some sort of UFO sound, because there is a legal requirement in a number of countries that they need to have some sort of sound to make people aware that it's traveling. They couldn't be all silent. So, and again, it's very difficult to say if this is a pro or a con with either one. Do you want the sound? Then, of course, you want a car that makes the sound. I personally don't care about the sound. I would like them to be like as silent as possible, So for me, the EV is the preferred choice here, because then I can listen to my sound inside the car, and the sound that comes from the car itself is less prevalent. So for me, that's a clear advantage, that the car itself is rather silent. Your choice. I cannot tell what's right for you. I can only tell what's right for me. Environment. This is really complex, because if you want to take this seriously, it's not like a clear-cut case. So the car itself, the EV battery requires rare metal, and mining of these is not very environmental friendly. So if you have two new cars, one petrol car or a combustion engine car and an EV standing next to each other, and you buy them and they haven't traveled a meter, if you look at the environmental footprint of those two, the EV starts with a bigger footprint. So if you buy them and put them in the garage and look at what state they are, the EV is less environment friendly at that point. So, and the next thing is, you want to top it up. So you want to drive it. So every meter you drive, you need to have something that sort of propels the vehicle. And here, electricity itself, well, if it's fossil fuels from oil, it's dirty. It's adding CO2 to the climate, and that's a bad thing. But diesel can be renewable, and in many countries there is a mandatory addition of renewables into the diesel. It's still CO2, but it's kind of coming from something, and it's part of a cycle. So from a CO2 perspective, it's sort of neutral, not really, but sort of. It still adds particle and dust and a lot of other crap to the environment, but purely from a CO2 perspective, it's not as bad as it could be, but it's still not good. Just caught a call there. I hope that wasn't a problem. The next part is electricity. Electricity itself is clean, so there is no problem with electricity on its own, basically. But not all production of electricity is clean. So, for instance, if coal is used, of course, it's not a renewable source of energy. Coal is really crappy. It's probably one of the worst things we can even have. So. There is a lot of CO2 emissions in the process, but still, I mean, if you compare like burning oil inside a power plant and burning petrols inside a car, the burning of petrol in a centralized environment is better than burning it locally. First of all, you don't need to have the actual kind of the burning equipment inside the car. And of course also the yield you have from the fuel to the energy you have in the car is better in a centralized location, and also kind of the purification of the exhaust is also a lot better in a centralized environment, because you can invest more and it doesn't really matter how much it weighs and all of that in a centralized location. So I mean, burning fossil inside a central location is environmentally not good, but better than burning it locally. So you could see a number of like ironic pictures of an EV being charged by a power plant that is coal based, and you're supposed to see the irony in that and yes, it doesn't take full advantage of the fact that you have an EV from an environment perspective, but it's still better than burning like fossil fuel inside the car. Okay, and also, I mean, if we continue that line of thought, that electricity, it depends on the electricity that is generated in your country. That's typically called the energy mix that you have in the country. So in Sweden, we are fortunate to have a lot of hydro. So a big portion of the national electricity is provided by a hydro, and hydro is that yields no CO2 emission whatsoever. Of course, I mean, concrete when you build the dams and all of that, that is of course an aspect, but when you run it, it's the weight of the water goes through the generator, and that generates electricity, and it's all super environmental friendly. You could argue that you are giving a number of breeds of fish a more difficult life, but that is sort of the amount of issues you have related to hydro. And then we also have nuclear, so we still have that, even if it's debated and all of that, and there has been like pros and cons over the last few decades if we should have it or not, and I think the discussion is basically the same in most other countries. So we have a very, very small portion of fossil. That's only when we have issue, and we now have a kind of significant contribution of wind as well, which is also environmental friendly. Again, you can argue on the negative sides of wind, but if you look at CO2 emission, it's basically non-existent. So we have a very, very clean mix, or clean in the aspect of no CO2 emissions. But if you take a country such as Poland, they are relying heavily on burning coal. And of course, if you take the electricity from that and you feed that into your electric car, that will not be as eco-friendly as using an EV in Sweden, given the country mix between, or the difference in mix between Poland and Sweden. I will show you a graph here. Okay, let me just be really frank here. I've sort of fabricated data here so that the graph would look like something I would like to say. And I could just have drawn lines on a piece of paper and showed you. So these are basically lines drawn on a piece of paper. I just did it digitally. But this is sort of my understanding, and I don't have any numbers here because these are not exact science numbers, and even if there are exact science numbers, I don't have them. So this is my interpretation of the state of what science believes in this context. So the grayish line is sort of a combustion engine. It starts off being less of an environmental footprint, and then the curvage is going upwards on a linear basis, and that is going upwards a lot faster than the EV. So it starts off better, but it's going at the rate where it will eventually overtake the other options. Some sort of statistics, and I've read a number of documentation on this, indicates that basically some sort of weighted average says that your EV would be more environmental friendly after like a year to 18 months compared to a combustion engine in Sweden. So if you're looking at the environmental aspect in Sweden, you are doing sort of a good thing if you're going to keep the car for a number of years. So EV is environmentally friendlier already after like a year to 18 months. It's still going over the lifespan of a normal car. It's still going to be a lot better also in Poland, but it will take a lot longer, possibly like 5-6 years before the curves eventually meet, and the EV in Poland is an environmentally better option than the combustion engine. And of course, you can weigh in all the factors with what is the share of renewable inside the diesel, if that is what you compare with, and what is the other aspects. Not all EVs have sort of the same environmental footprint, and also if you have something which is consuming a lot of fuel in the combustion engine option, then that could be more drastically leaning upwards, and they could meet a lot earlier. So there are a number of factors. This is just sort of getting a general sense of the area. So wrapping the environmental aspects thing up a bit, EVs start off worse, but every meter you drive them, they are catching up, and quite soon they are overtaking the combustion engine, and the combustion engine option is an inferior solution from the environmental aspect. Rather soon, and it takes shorter in a country with a rather clean energy mix, such as Sweden. It takes longer with a country with a less clean energy mix, such as Poland. But I mean, adding that aspect as well, it might also be that the most environmental friendly option would still be to use your own combustion engine car and run it to the end of its life, rather than buying a new one, because the environmental footprint of a new car is of course a lot when you factor that in. So here we're basically comparing if you should buy a new EV or a new combustion engine. That is comparing apples with apple in this example. Okay, one of the things that I hear as an argument against EV is the sort of uncertainty around batteries. People have argued that this is new technology and they do not dare to jump on it because they don't want to be the guinea pigs in this scenario. They would like somebody else to explore that, and only when they know 100% of everything of the technology, they're ready to jump on the bandwagon and potentially consider an EV. Again, nobody forces you to do anything here. And there are a number of people who are more prone to be early adopters, and some are late adopters, and some are even laggards. They are really, really late to the party because they don't want this in the first place. It happens with all new changes of all new things. Look at like mobile technology. It took a long time before everybody had a smartphone, but nowadays it's very unthinkable to not have a smartphone. I mean, not even the laggards are considering buying a smartphone anymore. So, and this is the same. So I should here say that there are a number of companies producing EVs. I mean, Volkswagen is doing it, Tesla is doing it, and Mercedes is doing it. And I mean, you can buy basically all the big brands. They would have an EV option. So it's quite often when you get to the discussion on EVs, especially people opposing EVs, they are opposing Tesla for a number of reasons. But I mean, if you don't like Tesla, then put Tesla aside. Look at the other option. Look at the Polestar. What about that one? And compare with that. You don't have to compare with Tesla. All Teslas are EV, but not all EVs are Tesla. Rather the opposite, actually. There are so many more vendors that produce EVs. But Tesla, they have been sort of in the game longest, and it's easiest to look at their data. The Model S was basically started to be a part of the market in 2014, and so there is a lot of data and a lot of statistics already available on sort of the deterioration of battery capacity in particularly Teslas, which isn't really available for most of the other brands because they are only been in the selling EVs a lot of years shorter. But Elon Musk, the guy that is behind Tesla, he has claimed that the batteries should last some 500,000 to 800,000 kilometers. And if you look at the sort of the normal range that people are driving, these are numbers that go well beyond what most cars have in them before they're thrown into garbage. There is a very, very small risk that you would have an issue where you would need to change the battery pack of an EV, unless you are driving it like a taxi or something else. Basically, only kind of cars driven in a commercial context are likely going to face the potential issue of changing batteries. A Tesla battery would degrade less than 10% after 300,000 kilometers. Okay, and 300,000 kilometers, very few cars would reach 300,000 kilometers before they're scrapped. So the issue of battery is not an issue. The only issue of batteries is that it's still high demand, and there are still too few that produce batteries. This is something that would improve over time as well, because EVs are growing, and the share of vehicles sold in all countries have an increasing share of EVs, which puts another extra requirements on delivery of batteries. But please don't take degradation of battery as an aspect when you choose a car, because the EV, if you're considering an EV, it's very, very unlikely that you would need to change the set of batteries, unless there is something kind of technically problematic with it. And then you would still possibly get it on warranty if it's sort of an early problem with them. But it's very unlikely that you will run into a problem unless you drive it on a commercial basis. Okay, the next thing here is cost. And there are two aspects of cost. One is purchase and one is ownership. So EVs are more expensive when you buy them, and please also try to compare Apple with Apple here. So don't compare the high-end Tesla with the low-end Opel, because that would be an unfair comparison between two very different cars. Please also don't compare a new car versus an old car, like a new Tesla versus an old Opel. That would be even more unfair. So the early models of EVs were more expensive. They were sold in rather small numbers. So the second-hand market for EVs is still very small. And comparing apples to apple means that a new EV versus a new combustion engine, that is a valid comparison. An old combustion engine, we don't really have anything to compare with, because there are not like enough old EVs to be a relevant market where everybody who would like to buy a second-hand EV could, because there's simply a shortage of them. So that basically means unless you can afford buying a new EV, it's the getting onto buying an EV is going to be very difficult, given the shortage of the second-hand one. So if you can afford an EV, the positive sides is that when you sell it, if you keep it a number of years and you sell it, it would have lost rather little value. So if you look at the decrease between the purchase price and the selling price, if you buy a new EV now, you are likely going to lose rather little over the years that you are the owner of that car. Even if it was expensive to start with, the price that you will get on the second-hand market is going to be rather high, which means that the delta, which is your actual cost of ownership, is likely going to be fairly small. I'm not saying it's like pennies here, but could be fairly small. I've seen a number of examples of people buying new Teslas a year ago, and they are selling them now at the same price that they bought them for in the first place. So and the reason why this is that there was a subsidy back then. So they had a subsidy, which means that the actual cost for them was a lot lower given the subsidy. And now they're selling them for the subsidized price, which means that the cost for ownership for this year for them has been zero. I understand the threshold is really high because you need to be able to afford it if you lease it, or however you obtain the car, the threshold is rather high. Second part is the cost of ownership. First of all, I would like to say service, because EVs, they contain a lot less movable parts than combustion engine cars. So you don't need like a regular checkup. You don't need to have like 3,000 kilometers checkout on your car because or a bi-yearly checkup of your car. You could of course do it, but there are no oil to be changed, there are no oil filters to be changed. The movable parts are integral in the electric engine, and there is no gearbox that could fail you, or no I don't know the terms for other kind of components in cars, but again, a number of less movable parts makes them less error prone than like a combustion engine car. And if you could do the service yourself, of course there's no real cost associated, but a lot of us who are not very skilled with engines or oily, greasy stuff, we need to buy the service. And if I look at the average cost I have for my old diesel car, it was well over 1,000 euros per year, more like 1,500. I have spent absolutely zero in service of my Tesla the first year I had it. So I don't know if that's going to kind of be the yearly cost for my entire the time I'm owning my EV, but I can still see that the first year is a lot cheaper because it's zero than the first year I had my Renault, which was my previous car, and the first year I had my Ford S-Max, which was the previous car I had. I think this is rather significant, and if you buy a new car, if you have a combustion engine car, there is typically like a service book, and you would like to ensure that you kind of you fulfill the obligation of every time the car asks you to take a service, you want to do it because the second-hand value of the car is significantly depending on you, or you have all the proper stamps in your service book. I don't even have a service book for the Tesla. It's not really there. So it's sort of app-based, so I can see all the interactions there has been with service and Tesla in general. But and I guess some of it might follow the car to a new owner if and when I decide to buy it. But it's not really a thing. You don't need like a yearly service or a bi-yearly service. It's not a cost that you need to kind of budget for. Fuel. Here, if you look at like fossil fuel, there is quite heavy taxes on it on many countries. And there is, of course, also tax on electricity. But typically, the tax on electricity is lower. Let me also say that how you define consumption of a car is different in different countries. So in Sweden, we tend to express the consumption of a car is how many liters do they consume per 10 kilometers, a mile. The Swedish mile is 10 kilometers. And let's say 0.7 is sort of reasonable, that an old Passat would probably be like 0.7 liters for 10 kilometers. In Denmark, they go the other way around. How far can you get on a liter? So in Sweden, the number should be as low as possible. In Denmark, it should be as high as possible because you want to go as far as possible on every liter. So let's say the same example with a Passat on that would be 0.7 in Sweden would probably be something like 1.3 in Denmark, because you get you get 13 kilometers on 1 liter. It should be 13. I've noted 1.3, but let's say 13 then. And then I know in the US you have miles per gallon, and because the concept of miles is totally random to me, and gallon because they're also different. You have US gallon and imperial gallons. I'm totally lost. And so the metrics you have there doesn't tell me anything. But it doesn't really matter. I'm now going to use the EU principle because that is liter per 100 kilometers. And bear with me, I will show you a table of this, and I will calculate that from Swedish crowns to euros for comparison. And the decimals, they are not really important, so do neglect them, and they are valid from on when I record this, but I mean, tomorrow the tax on fuel could be something else, and your tax on fuel could be something else. So don't look at the decimals. Look at like the order of magnitude of the numbers here. Okay, so the headings here would be Swedish crowns per liter, the consumption of the car per 100 kilometers, and then the cost, the calculated cost for that in Swedish crowns and euros. So for diesel, the diesel here in Sweden is 28 Swedish crowns per liter. And well, divide it with 10 and you get a rough estimate on how much that would be in euro. It's actually 11, but the US dollar is basically the same as well. So that would be 2.8 euros or US dollars for a liter. For normal petrol is 21, so 2.1 or 2-ish. And I've taken the example of a Volkswagen Passat. That's 6.1. That's the 6.1 liters is the consumption over 100 kilometers, and 7.1 would be the petrol version. So the cost for driving 100 kilometers using a VW Passat would be 170 Swedish crowns if it was diesel, and would be 149 if it was a petrol. And that would be 15.5 euro versus 13.5 euros. If I also make an assumption that you are driving like the average of what's normal in Sweden, that is 11,000 kilometers, you would have a cost of 1,700 euros per year if you drove those 11,000 kilometers using a diesel. And it will be 1,490, let's say 1,500 euros if you were driving a petrol. Now let's look at the Tesla option here. So the headings are the same, but the consumption on an EV is how many kilowatt hours is consumed over 100 kilometers. It could be in the Tesla. It's expressed as how many watt hours per kilometers. So it's a factor of 1,000 because kilowatt hours. So I've just computed here to be 100 kilometers and the number of kilowatt hours. So kilowatt is sort of the size of the charging at every given time. So if you charge 100 watt in an hour, you have 100 watt hours charged. So that's adding the time aspect. So yeah, it's not that difficult actually, the difference between watt and watt hours. And if I look at my own cost here, would be when I'm charging at home, I charge for 2 Swedish crowns per kilowatt hour. You could have the option of having a price which is set per hour. I have a daily average, and this is a summary of my daily average. We have a cost for the actual cable, and then we have a cost for the electricity that comes on top of this. And part of this is, of course, tax and all of that. So the summary here, if I add those two together, including all the taxes, my cost is 2 Swedish crowns per kilowatt hour average over the day. If I go to one of the public chargers, like the Tesla superchargers, they have recently increased the prices from 5 to around 8 Swedish crowns per kilowatt hours. And according to the specs, this would be 15. So the consumption of the Tesla Model Y that I have should be 15 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. But in real life, it's not going to be that, because I live in a cold country, and whenever I need to heat the car, that takes from the battery. And if I take something out of the battery, that means that the range is shorter, and the average consumption is also going up. So I'm here counting on 17, but I guess if I look at just the specs, it should probably be 15 here. And if I do the same calculation here, that means that the same 100 kilometers would cost me 3 euros. So that would be my cost for traveling 100 kilometers compared to the 15 using a diesel. If I charge using a public charger, the price would be 12. And if I make some sort of average here, where I mostly charge at home, and sometimes during my longer trips I need to use the public ones, and here I only used 20% of public and 80% of the of home charging. I don't know if that's your average. It's just taking my average, and so my average would probably be around 464 here. And again, assuming that you travel these 11,000 kilometers, the yearly cost for charging here for me, if I only use my home charging, would be 340 euros. Compare that to the 1,700 or the 1,500. Right. Okay, so if you buy an EV, it will cost you a premium when you buy it. You are likely going to get a lot of that back when you sell it. And the cost for owning it, like the capital cost for owning it, is likely going to be a lot better than you might think when you look at the rather hefty price tag of the new one. The charge that you are paying for service is basically neglectable. And also the money you pay for actually driving the car, the charging, unless you are relying on charging in public charging stations always, is going to be a lot less. So there are pros and cons in the equation here for the EV compared to the combustion engine car, but do weigh in that when you make your general calculation, and the more you drive, the better the EV economy looks like. So, I mean, I'm driving more than the 11,000 kilometers. I'm more driving like 30,000 kilometers, which means that I earn a lot more. So my delta between the two would be a lot more, which means that the EV financially for me is a lot better than the figures, like 3 times better than the figures I showed you just now. Okay, and I mean the cars, and here is also a discussion with people having, they are comparing like a German premium car like a Mercedes or a BMW, and then they compare it with the Tesla. And they are quite different cars. I mean, and if you don't like Tesla, don't buy a Tesla. Buy an electric BMW. If you really like BMW, there are electric BMWs. You don't need to buy a combustion engine BMW. Compare them and see the difference. And also be aware of the financial difference of owning them and running them, because they are significant. I'm not saying that the electric option is the better one for you, but do ensure that you are aware that most brands also have an electric option when you do your comparison. So, and if I try to summarize this, there are people who really should have a combustion engine car, there are nobody that should have an EV. But looking at the average, the EV is beneficial. Objectively looking from the side, it looks like the EV is a much better option for a number of people. So, but for old cars, if you have an issue of buying an expensive new car, you need to buy an old car. If your financial situation is such that you need to buy a second-hand car, you're sort of still locked outside of the EV market, because also the second-hand ones are so expensive. So it's probably difficult for you to kind of get the entry ticket to the EV market. And saying that means that you pay a little less of an entry fee, but you need to pay a premium for every year you buy it, you own it. If you can service it yourself, you are offsetting a bit of that. And if you're not driving that much, the consumption of fuel might not be as severe as it could be. But both those aspects are significant in the total cost of ownership of a combustion car, which is much less if you buy an EV. For new cars, I mean, there you can actually compare them. There is apple to apple. And again, you still have the issue of a new EV typically being a bit more expensive, but then you probably have the option of saving on the smaller total cost of ownership during the period you are owning the car. So if you can only afford an old car, you are sort of forced into the pocket of combustion engine. And also, if you are driving far on a regular basis beyond the normal range of an EV, there you really need to consider the fact that the combustion engine option is better for you. It's faster to charge, to top up or fill up the car, and you get further without topping up or refilling the car. And if so, travel far under a time pressure, combustion engine is a lot more beneficial. And if that is an important part of your use case, you're probably one of those that should have a combustion engine car for obvious reasons. And also, if you can't afford the initial cost, then you're also sort of forced into the combustion engine pocket, because the EV is not for you if you can't afford that first ticket to buy it. But if you're not one of those two categories, then I should urge you to look into potentially an EV, because it would be cheaper, it would be more environmentally friendly. It has a number of additional perks. I mean, the acceleration of an EV compared to an acceleration of a normal. So if you're overtaking somebody, if you have an EV, overtaking another car is so much quicker. Again, my Tesla is nothing special. I have the lowest spec one, and it's still 0 to 100 in 4.8 seconds. Compare that to my old diesel. They are not on the same page on that. So I hope you found this informative. I hope I've been able to kind of convey the total cost for especially refilling, and the difference that it actually is on refilling them on a per year basis. Welcome, and hope to see you sometime in the near future. So bye. You have now been pointed at by Pontus. Bye.